Every day I take the violin, it's so special. I only play music that touches my heart, and that's not only classical music or pop music, it's all music, but it must touch my heart. And I know when it touches my heart, it will touch your heart.
Yeah.
In March 2024, the music paused, but it didn't stop. For the first time in decades, Andre Rieu, the tireless Waltz King whose violin had serenaded millions across the globe, was forced off stage. This was a moment of reckoning for a man who had spent his life defying age, fatigue, and limits in the name of beauty and joy. So, what happened to Andre Rieu at 75? Well, try not to cry when you see this. Let's get started. The 2008 disaster. Born on October 1st, 1949, in Maastricht, Netherlands, Andre Rieu has revived the romance of the 19th century waltz, reimagined for the modern era. His father, Andre Rieu Sr., was the conductor of the Limburg Symphony Orchestra and instilled in him a deep respect for classical forms. However, even as a child, Rieu found the formality of the concert hall stifling. It was this belief that music should bring joy that ultimately led him to form the Johann Strauss Orchestra in 1987. What started as a modest ensemble of 12 musicians grew into an internationally recognized force, performing to sold-out arenas around the world and reviving the grandeur of Viennese waltzes in an age more attuned to pop than polka. By the early 2000s, Andre Rieu had ascended to a level of fame rarely seen in classical circles. He was not just performing, he was touring like a rock star, often ranking among the top-grossing male touring artists globally. His concerts became immersive events with elaborate sets, theatrical lighting, and audience interaction that turned every performance into a celebration. But for all the smiles, swirling gowns, and lilting Strauss melodies, Rieu's journey was not untouched by darkness. The image of the endlessly cheerful maestro concealed a man weighed down by pressures that few could see. The turning point came in 2008, during the height of his career. That year, Rieu decided to undertake what would become his most ambitious and ultimately disastrous artistic endeavor. He commissioned a full-scale, meticulously detailed replica of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna to serve as the stage backdrop for his upcoming world tour. The original Schönbrunn, once the summer residence of the Habsburg emperors, represented the height of classical elegance, a monument to the very musical heritage he sought to bring to life. His vision was to transport audiences not just musically, but also visually and emotionally into the golden age of the waltz. However, the project quickly spiraled out of control. The cost of constructing and transporting the replica across continents ballooned to nearly 34 million euros. It was a breathtaking investment, made with the belief that the unique theatricality of the performances would draw enough audience enthusiasm and ticket sales to make it sustainable. But the timing could not have been worse. As the 2008 global financial crisis unfolded, economies reeled, and the entertainment industry, like many others, took a hit. Audiences became hesitant. Spending on luxuries like concert tickets dropped sharply. Rieu's extravagant set, though stunning, became a financial albatross. The cost of shipping and assembling it from country to country was overwhelming, and the financial returns could not keep up. Within months, Andre Rieu Productions was facing catastrophic losses. Several shows were cancelled due to logistical challenges and Rieu's sudden health complications, particularly in Australia and Germany. Dutch media reported that his company was facing tens of millions of euros in debt. This wasn't just a blow to his reputation. It was a deeply personal crisis. The weight of this near collapse affected Rieu in profound ways. He has spoken candidly in later years about the emotional turmoil he experienced, the depression, the sleepless nights, and the feeling of failure. He had poured everything, creatively, financially, and emotionally, into a dream that seemed to have unraveled in a matter of weeks. During this period, it was his wife, Marjorie, who became his anchor. A musicologist, composer, and former teacher, she had always worked behind the scenes, contributing to the artistic and business side of Rieu's empire. Now, she became his closest advisor and confidant in navigating the financial crisis. Together, they made difficult but necessary decisions, such as scaling back operations, canceling further use of the palace replica, and restructuring their finances to ensure survival. With humility and determination, Andre Rieu began to rebuild. He returned to basics, the heart of what had always made his music resonate. Gone were the extravagant sets and risky theatrical ventures. In their place came more grounded productions that emphasized connection, emotion, and the raw joy of shared musical experience. What followed in the subsequent years was a kind of renaissance. Rieu's performances retained their hallmark charm, the humor, the spontaneity, the crowd engagement, but now with a quieter depth behind the sparkle. Albums like Forever Vienna in 2009 became statements of resilience. His return to sold-out concerts was not just a commercial recovery, but a personal victory. There is something profoundly human in Rieu's journey. It shows us that even those who appear larger than life, who bring joy and elegance to others, are not immune to fear, doubt, or failure. His willingness to speak openly about his struggles has endeared him even more to fans, many of whom have faced their own personal hardships. Rieu's ability to smile, to pick up his violin, and continue playing wasn't just professionalism, it was courage. However, that is not to say that all is perfect for him. A peek behind the curtain. To the adoring millions who flock to his concerts or tune in from afar, Andre Rieu appears as a tireless beacon of joy. With his ever-present smile, elegant tales, and that gleaming violin tucked under his chin, he seems to have stepped straight out of a more romantic century. Part conductor, part courtly entertainer, part magician, his music transcends language, culture, and even cynicism, conjuring moments of nostalgia and wonder in sold-out arenas. Yet behind the tuxedo and stage lights is a man who has quietly fought private battles that fame could neither protect him from nor entirely conceal. From the very beginning, Andre Rieu wasn't just playing music. He was curating a universe. His Johann Strauss Orchestra, founded in 1987, was not merely a group of musicians. It was a traveling embodiment of Rieu's vision of joy, elegance, and charm. He wasn't conducting performances so much as creating experiences. Concert halls transformed into Viennese ballrooms, adorned with chandeliers, costumes, and scripted spontaneity. But as the productions grew more elaborate, so did the pressure. The music was no longer the only thing he had to control. There were payrolls, lighting rigs, transportation logistics, stage construction, marketing strategies, and a reputation that had to be defended against the sneering dismissals of classical purists. His public persona never betrayed this strain. Andre Rieu was always on, always the cheerful maestro with a twinkle in his eye, a joke on his lips, and a bow ready to sweep into another round of the second waltz. But privately, the weight grew crushing. He confessed in interviews that the anxiety of keeping hundreds of people employed, including musicians, stagehands, designers, and office staff, often consumed him. When something went wrong, whether it was a missed note or a business setback, he took it personally. The orchestra wasn't a job. It was his life's work, his identity, his family. Perhaps nowhere was this vulnerability more exposed than during the aforementioned 2008 crisis. The external collapse was mirrored by an internal one. Rieu spoke of the sleepless nights, the dread in his chest, the tears shed in private. What pained him most wasn't the prospect of bankruptcy, but the thought of having let people down. His fans, yes, but especially his orchestra. Many of them had been with him for decades. Some were closer than friends. They were like family. The idea of disbanding them, of dissolving the musical bond he had spent decades nurturing, was unbearable. His wife, Marjorie, helped restructure finances, rethought business models, and brought a measure of calm to the chaos. With her help, Rieu began the painful process of scaling down, abandoning the Schönbrunn project, canceling tours, and revisiting the fundamentals of his musical vision. And slowly, the tide began to turn. But even as his company stabilized, Rieu was not out of the woods. His health began to fray. In 2010, he suffered a viral infection that severely affected his inner ear, disrupting his balance and leaving him unable to perform. What began as dizziness became something far more frightening, an abrupt halt to everything he had ever known. Shows had to be postponed. Tours were disrupted. The public, ever loyal, responded with concern. But privately, Rieu was shaken. "I was lying in bed," he recalled, "and suddenly the room began to spin." For a man so closely identified with movement, rhythm, and poise, this betrayal of his own body was a deeply personal blow. The recovery was not swift. It involved physical therapy, rest, and an enforced pause on the otherwise relentless cycle of performances. But it also forced him to reckon with something deeper, the unsustainable pace he had maintained for so many years. The perfectionism that had propelled him to greatness had also brought him to the edge. He began to speak more openly about his insomnia, about the nights spent staring into the dark, overwhelmed by thoughts he couldn't quiet. He described how each concert wasn't just a performance, but a battle against the fear of failure. Yet through all this, Rieu never stopped playing. Even when the spotlight felt too bright, or the silence after a show too oppressive, he clung to the music. It became, as it had always been, both sword and shield. The act of performance, though it demanded everything from him, also gave him something in return: a fleeting peace, a reconnection with joy. For a few hours each night, as he bowed and danced and led his orchestra through another waltz, the world made sense again. In his later years, Andre Rieu has adopted a tone that is both gentler and more grounded. He no longer chases scale for its own sake. His shows remain spectacular, but they are now tempered with experience. There is an intimacy to his interactions, a tenderness in the way he addresses his audience or jokes with his orchestra members. He speaks about balance, about treasuring time with family, about allowing moments of stillness into his once racing schedule. The smile is still there, but now it carries weight. It is the smile of someone who has survived himself. The Johann Strauss Orchestra, too, is more than a professional entity. It reflects endurance, not just Rieu's, but theirs. Many of its members have weathered the same storms, stood by him through the financial collapse, the health scares, the sleepless tours. Their bond, forged in countless rehearsal halls and airport lounges, is palpable on stage. When they play, it is not just a performance. It is a reunion, a reaffirmation, a kind of triumph. In interviews, Rieu has said that music is not an escape from life, but a way of confronting it. "It's not about forgetting your problems," he once said, "but about feeling them differently." Perhaps that is why so many continue to flock to his concerts. And that, ultimately, is the true story of Andre Rieu. Not the grandeur or the sold-out arenas, not the lavish productions or the golden violin, but the man who has known failure and fear, who has wept behind the curtain and risen time and again to meet the music. A man who has learned that joy is not something you inherit. It is something you fight for, fiercely and tenderly, every day. Well, at least, nobody does it better. The magic of the Johann Strauss Orchestra. By the mid-1980s, Andre Rieu had checked every box required of a serious classical musician. He had trained at the Conservatoire Royal in Liège and the Conservatorium Maastricht, developing a deep technical command of the violin. He had performed with traditional orchestras and fulfilled every academic expectation imposed by the institutions that shaped him. And yet, something within him refused to settle. The structured solemnity of the classical world, the formality of its concerts, the distance between performer and audience, and the reverence that often muted genuine emotion felt increasingly suffocating. Music, in Rieu's view, had ceased to breathe. The world he saw on stage was refined, yes, but cold, lifeless, detached. And he wanted more than that. He wanted laughter, dancing, tears, applause, not as a rare reaction, but as the very point of the performance. So in 1987, Rieu made the kind of decision that only comes from equal parts passion and rebellion. He founded his own orchestra, not a modest quartet or ensemble, but a waltz orchestra named for the Waltz King himself, Johann Strauss II. The Johann Strauss Orchestra began with just 12 musicians and none of the insulation enjoyed by national symphonies. There was no government subsidy, no celebrity conductor waving a baton of institutional privilege. What there was, however, was conviction. Their mission was radical in its simplicity: to revive the waltz not for the elite, but for the people. This was not an orchestra designed to intimidate or lecture. It was born to enchant, to invite audiences into the music rather than demand silent awe. Rieu envisioned concerts where people clapped, swayed, and even danced in the aisles. He wanted emotion on display, not just on stage, but in the crowd. In many ways, this was heresy to the classical elite. Critics dismissed him early on as unserious, as kitschy, as someone turning art into a carnival. But Rieu pressed forward, because the reaction he received from ordinary listeners, the gasps of recognition, the standing ovations, the teary smiles, told him he was right. The early years were a test of faith. Without corporate sponsors or institutional allies, Rieu financed his own shows, often teetering on the edge of insolvency. Venues were hard to come by, and there were moments when it felt like the dream might end before it ever truly began. Behind every exuberant performance was a logistical nightmare of budget constraints, long hours, and countless rejections. However, in 1994, Rieu released Strauss & Co., the album that changed everything. Featuring his now iconic rendition of The Second Waltz, it quickly captured the public's imagination. First in the Netherlands, then across Europe, and eventually around the globe, audiences connected with the sheer beauty of it all. It was not austere or intimidating. It was lush, romantic, and joyful. The album's success opened doors. Suddenly, television networks wanted to broadcast his concerts. Recording studios were eager to partner. The Johann Strauss Orchestra began to expand rapidly, eventually becoming one of the largest private orchestras in the world. The spirit of the early performances never faded, even as the productions grew grander. The venues changed, from small halls to massive arenas, from modest stages to historic locations like the Hofburg Palace or the Freihof Square in Maastricht. But the emotional core remained. Fans arrived dressed in ball gowns and suits, not out of obligation, but enthusiasm. Rieu wasn't just giving them music, he was transporting them. For a few hours, they weren't in a modern, fractured reality. They were in Vienna, in a world of waltzes and candlelight and infinite possibility. As Rieu's concerts became global events, he faced a new kind of challenge: how to top himself. With every tour, every album, expectations grew. People didn't just want beautiful music anymore. They wanted spectacle. And Rieu delivered. His shows featured elaborate stage sets, theatrical lighting, and performers who danced and joked as easily as they played their instruments. But these wonders came at a cost. The logistics of transporting a massive orchestra, along with their instruments, wardrobes, and equipment, around the world became increasingly complex. It wasn't long before the burden began to show. Rieu began to feel the strain of the empire he had built. He wasn't just a violinist or conductor anymore. He was a CEO, a marketer, a tour manager, and the financial bedrock of an enterprise employing hundreds. The very orchestra that had once liberated him from the stifling norms of traditional music now tethered him to an unrelenting schedule. Album releases were no longer moments of joy, but deadlines to meet. Tours were less about adventure and more about survival. He has spoken candidly and with surprising vulnerability about these pressures. The stress was sometimes overwhelming. Creative anxiety crept in, particularly after his Schönbrunn Palace project left his company in deep financial trouble. But through it all, the Johann Strauss Orchestra remained his constant. Many of its members have played with him for decades, forming a kind of traveling family. Their chemistry is real, earned through thousands of hours of rehearsal, performance, and road-weary travel. The humor that audiences see on stage, the playful glances, the improvised jokes, the unexpected solos, are not gimmicks, but the language of a troupe that has learned how to trust one another. This ensemble has weathered not just the highs of global fame, but the lows of personal and collective burnout. Their resilience is part of the magic. Rieu has often said that music is healing and that belief animates every note he plays. He's not trying to convert audiences into scholars or impress them with complexity. He wants to remind them how to feel. A waltz is like a shared memory, a longing, a celebration. And in a world increasingly defined by division and noise, that is no small thing. His concerts are attended by people from all walks of life, from school children to pensioners, from seasoned musicians to first-time listeners. They laugh together, sway together, and weep together. It is this capacity for unity that has become the Johann Strauss Orchestra's greatest achievement. Yes, they have released platinum albums. Yes, they have sold out stadiums. But their true legacy lies in the millions of hearts they've stirred. In homes where families gather around the television to watch a concert. In wedding halls where a couple takes their first dance to the Blue Danube. In hospital rooms where music brings a fleeting moment of peace. As Andre Rieu enters the later chapters of his life, he speaks more frequently about reflection. He hints at slowing down, not to stop, but to savor. The thought of stepping away is difficult, not because he fears obscurity, but because his identity is so entangled with the orchestra he created. And one has to wonder, even if it hurts to ask, for how much longer can he carry on? How long can one man bear the emotional and logistical weight of such a vast musical undertaking? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the real legacy of the Johann Strauss Orchestra isn't in how long it lasts under Rieu's direct baton, but in what it has proven to be possible. That classical music can laugh, that audiences can waltz through history without needing a conservatory degree, that beauty can be accessible without being diluted. Andre Rieu and his orchestra have shown that joy, far from being frivolous, is its own kind of art. And that art, at its highest, is not what elevates the few, but what invites the many. And if the day comes when Rieu does step back, he will do so knowing that the world he dreamed of, the world of laughter, light, violins, and humanity, already exists, because he built it. Speaking of stepping back, try not to cry. In March 2024, Andre Rieu found himself confronting a sobering reminder of mortality. While in Mexico City, poised to lead a series of highly anticipated performances, the 74-year-old maestro fell ill. What began as a routine bout of the flu quickly spiraled into something far more serious: a high fever and complete physical exhaustion. His condition forced him to cancel several concerts, disrupting a world tour that had been mapped out months in advance. Fans across Latin America were heartbroken, but the disappointment quickly turned into concern and compassion. Messages of love, prayers, and get-well-soon notes began pouring in from every corner of the globe. And yet, behind the well-wishes and public updates, Rieu himself was grappling with something even deeper than illness. This was a moment of reckoning. For decades, Rieu had defied age and expectation, with a pace that exhausted even his much younger colleagues. His performances were not simple recitals, but immersive spectacles that blended classical precision with theatrical flair. The Johann Strauss Orchestra, which he founded in 1987 with just 12 musicians, had grown into one of the largest and most beloved private orchestras in the world. Touring with them meant navigating complex logistics, overseeing rehearsals, personally engaging with each element of production, from lighting to stage design, and above all, preserving the magic that audiences had come to expect from every performance. Rieu was not just the conductor. He was the soul of the show. And for years, he had kept that soul burning at full intensity, traveling from continent to continent with barely time to rest between engagements. Yet, even for someone as tenacious and passionate as Rieu, the body has its limits. The flu that struck him in Mexico was not just a passing ailment. It was a culmination of years of physical strain. While Rieu's ever-present smile and elegant stage demeanor had long concealed the toll that such an aggressive touring schedule demanded, those closest to him had begun to see subtle signs of wear. In quieter moments, he'd mention the fatigue that never quite lifted, the jet lag that took longer to recover from, and the unrelenting pressure to top his last tour. But he rarely dwelt on these matters. The music, the audience, the joy, all of it outweighed the cost. Or so he believed. During his enforced downtime in Mexico, Rieu was given something he hadn't had in years: stillness. And in that stillness came reflection. Confined to rest, far from the stage, and unable to lead his orchestra, he had no choice but to acknowledge what had long gone unspoken. He could not go on like this forever. It wasn't just about the flu. The tempo of his life needed to shift. The decision to cancel shows was not made lightly. Rieu is famously disciplined and deeply committed to his audience. He once said that his greatest fear wasn't failure. It was letting people down. So to pull out of performances, particularly in a region where he has some of his most passionate fans, was both heartbreaking and humbling. But the severity of his condition left no room for compromise. As his team released statements assuring the public of his recovery, internal conversations turned more serious. Was this a one-time scare? Or had the time come to reimagine how the maestro would continue his life's work? Upon returning to the Netherlands, Rieu made a quiet but significant decision. There would be no retirement. The stage still called to him. The waltz still danced in his heart. But things would change. Going forward, his tours would be spaced out more generously. Instead of marathon performances across continents with little time to recover, his schedule would now include built-in pauses, moments to breathe, to reset, to live. Behind the scenes, the adjustments began to take form. His crew, many of whom had been with him for decades, were more than willing to adapt. This wasn't just a job to them. It was a shared mission, a labor of love. They restructured tour logistics, booked venues with greater spacing between events, and ensured that every performance would not only be spectacular, but also sustainable. Rieu, for his part, also began to take better care of himself. He prioritized sleep, simplified his travel arrangements, and even stepped back, just slightly, from micromanaging every element of production. This newfound space allowed him to rediscover parts of life that had been crowded out by years on the road. Longer conversations with family, unhurried mornings, the simple pleasure of walking through his garden without a suitcase by the door. For longtime fans, this moment echoed a similar health scare in 2010 when Rieu had suffered from a viral infection that affected his equilibrium and forced him to postpone concerts. That incident, too, had revealed the fragility behind the grandeur. But 2024 felt different. There was a gravity to this illness, perhaps because Rieu himself was no longer in his 50s, but well into his 70s. What's remarkable is how, in this moment of vulnerability, Rieu's bond with his audience grew even stronger. Fans didn't just wish him well, they rallied around him. Across Europe, Latin America, Asia, and beyond, tribute events were organized. People gathered in community halls, town squares, and living rooms to play his music, watch his concert DVDs, and share stories of the impact he'd had on their lives. And so, when he returned to the stage later that year, something had shifted. The music was the same, but the energy carried a new layer of meaning. The man who stood before the orchestra was no less dynamic, no less charming, but there was a quiet softness beneath the grandeur, a humility born from pain and reflection. He moved with a different kind of grace now, one that acknowledged limits not as weaknesses, but as truths to be honored. In interviews following his recovery, Rieu spoke candidly about what the illness had taught him. "You cannot pour from an empty cup," he said. "Even joy needs rest." He talked about the need for artists to protect their well-being, to reject the myth that relentless output is the measure of success. For someone who had spent his life defying the classical establishment, Rieu was now challenging a different convention, that of artistic self-sacrifice. The Johann Strauss Orchestra, ever loyal, responded in kind. Their performances took on even greater warmth, and the camaraderie among musicians, many of whom had been with Rieu for over 2 decades, shone brighter than ever. Today, André Rieu continues to create, perform, and inspire. But he does so with a deeper understanding of what it means to endure. True legacy is not built through unbroken motion, but through balance, authenticity, and the courage to evolve. His illness in March 2024 did not diminish his light. It refined it. It reminded the world that even legends must pause, and that the music can still play, perhaps even more beautifully, when accompanied by the silence of reflection. Looking back on his journey, Rieu's story reads like a grand waltz itself. It moves through crescendos and rests, dazzling spins and quiet holds. But through every step, it never loses rhythm. Because for André Rieu, the real magic isn't just in the notes. It's in the courage to keep dancing, no matter what the tempo of life demands. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, Please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.